Everyone, I am Allison Barnett. I am a co-chair for the Launch Conference Committee. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining session 2.2. You're getting a twofer this morning. In this session, we will have both looking inward, looking outward, the value of self-organized discussion groups for peer managers. And then directly following that, still here with that link, is balance and guardrails, individual practices, and organizational strategies for addressing workplace stress. I would like, please remain muted to minimize background noise. This session is being recorded for us to put up later for people to access. We also have live captioning enabled. You can hide that or you can let it run so you can see it. And if you have questions towards the end, we will have a few minutes for questions after each presentation. Please put those questions in the chat and the presenters will get to you as they can with those questions. So I am going to hand it over to looking inward, looking outward, the value of self-organized discussion groups for peer managers.
Thank you, Allison. We're just going to introduce ourselves and get right into it. I'm Molly Bragg. I'm the head of digital collections and curation services at Duke University Libraries, and my pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Emily Daly. I'm interim head of research and instructional services at the Duke University Library, and my pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Kim Duckett, head of research engagement at the North Carolina State University Libraries, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm going to get us started. During this short talk, we will highlight a strategy for leveraging middle managers' collective wisdom, self-organized discussion groups that bring middle managers together to learn from one another. Although we are focusing on managers, this strategy can be used with any kind of group of participants who want to learn together in the workplace. But first, let's take a moment to connect virtually in the spirit of community, which is the conference theme. When we are on Zoom, we can lose the elements of what Priya Parker, author of The Art of Gathering, has called micro-expressions of choice, little things that we might see about each other in a physical space, like someone bringing a favorite tea mug to the meeting or some fun stickers on a colleague's laptop. We'd like each of you to take a moment to share in the chat box some micro-expression of choice from the space where you are right now, your work office space, your work from home space, wherever you are. What's something you see right now that's an expression of you in whatever workspace you're in? I'm going to pause a second and let y'all contribute to the chat.
And I'll just call out a couple that I'm seeing. I see bulletin board of pictures, a cat condo, a stuffed version of your dog. That's awesome. Lots of buttons on your pin board, plants, transformers, birthday cards. Ooh, happy birthday if you're celebrating a birthday today or recently. Pens and markers, a long lazy dog, coffee cat, poster from a sci-fi podcast you like. Awesome. Thank you for sharing those.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. So I'm going to get us going by describing the nature of these self-organizing manager groups that we're talking about. It's not too complicated to understand. These groups that we're considering are self-organizing. They aren't formally charged, and participants join because they feel an affinity to the group's purpose. They span structures. In other words, they have the ability to expand across organizational boundaries like departments and divisions. And members have a shared purpose. Also, these members are peers, not friends. In other words, we're not talking about friends who view each other as confidants and naturally come together to share information, commiserate, and get support. The members might also be friends, but this is not what is bringing them together. And these groups are different than task groups, with a charge coming together to work on a particular project or problem, although the information shared within the group might help to bolster or inform the work of specific task groups. These groups are communities of practice, which Eddie and Wenger, who coined the concept, describe like this. Communities of practice are groups of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. According to Wenger, communities of practice have three key characteristics. First, there is a domain. There is a shared identity defined by a shared interest or domain and competence that distinguishes members. There is a community. Members engage in shared activities and build relationships in order to learn from each other. And there is a practice. Members of a community of practice are practitioners. They develop a shared repertoire of resources, experiences, stories, tools, and ways of addressing recurring problems so that they can grow and learn from each other. Members of communities of practice can learn together through a variety of activities. This chart provides a snapshot of different activities such as solving problems together, information sharing, learning from the experiences of others, coordinating efforts, discussing developments, and more. We've shared our slides so you can take a closer look at this chart. And here are the purposes of 3 communities of practice that between the 3 of us, Emily, Molly, and myself, that we have each participated in during the pandemic, some of us in multiple groups. So one of them is attendees of a leadership program, extending their learning and takeaways from the program by meeting regularly together. Another one is a group of managers coming together to focus on issues related to equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, with a focus on our roles and identities as managers who want to be anti-racist. And the third one is a cross-divisional group of managers meeting regularly to share information across divisions, to discuss issues related to staff and organizational needs, and to find ways to amplify our advocacy as middle managers. Now I'll turn it over to Emily to describe what we see as beneficial about such groups.
Thanks, Kim. Before we look at why these groups are worth the time and energy they require, let's connect again in the chat. Take a moment to think of a discussion you had with a colleague or a group of colleagues, either in your workplace or outside of your workplace, that you found particularly helpful or meaningful. What made that interaction meaningful or helpful? Type a word or phrase that comes to mind in the chat, and I'll call out a few of these as you go along. Again, what made the interaction meaningful? You learned something new ideas. Got good advice, collaborative problem solving, trust. Context for a problem you were having, new perspectives, thoughtful reflection back, active listening. They were interested in what you had to say and vice versa. Different perspectives, usually applicable to direct action. Awesome, yeah, we've benefited from all of these things in the groups that we're talking about today. So we 3 have personally reaped these and numerous other benefits from self-organizing manager groups. Oops, there we go. First, these groups allow for ongoing professional development that evolves to meet members' changing needs. Participants help set agendas and suggest discussion topics, and they often have an eager audience because their peers are encountering similar challenges or joys. For instance, what are tips for managing up or across other managers? What are the best ways to communicate sensitive changes or decisions that are not popular with everyone? What are successful strategies for motivating a talented staff member who's no longer feeling challenged or is just plain burnout? Some topics are universal among managers regardless of their work context, but it can be particularly valuable to talk with peer managers within the same institution. They likely know the organizational culture. They've experienced some of the same roadblocks or successes, observed the same cultural norms, and participated in library-wide initiatives like goal setting or strategic planning that inform a shared understanding. Group conversations can be more specific and possibly more meaningful because participants have immediate context for the conversation. Discussions are often enriched by nuances that would be lost in a group of peer managers from different institutions. These groups also increase opportunities for information sharing and communication across managers who might not interact or work together regularly. The circumstances of the last 2 years have resulted in significantly fewer opportunities for hallway conversations, so it's been crucial to our professional growth to carve out time to exchange ideas with managers in other units. We've borrowed team building or goal setting ideas from each other, talked through expectations for staff working remotely or on hybrid schedules, and informed each other about task groups formed to address an organizational need that we can all benefit from knowing about. And Kim, if you want to, yeah, there we go. These groups also strengthen the library as a whole by creating or deepening connections among people across organizational boundaries. Through communities of practice, I've developed relationships with peer managers I wouldn't otherwise interact with, let alone discuss weighty topics like internal salary equity or white privilege in the workplace with. We've built trust that's enabled us to strategize ways to use our positional power for the benefit of the library and its staff. For instance, by advocating for more resources to advance the library's racial equity goals. As a result of these connections, I'm more likely to reach out to peer managers to troubleshoot issues or ask for their unit's participation on task groups or hiring committees. Academia tends to be siloed, and the pandemic has made us even more insular. These types of groups not only benefit individual members, they also foster a more cohesive staff. Self-organizing groups provide opportunities for managers to develop a shared repertoire of resources, experiences, stories, tools, ways of addressing recurring problems. Reflecting on our roles and building a management practice requires sustained attention. The composition of these groups varies slightly from meeting to meeting, but the recurring themes contribute to the group's identity and to participants' personal growth and development. For instance, a manager might attend a conference or immersive experience and come back eager to share and apply what they learned, but it can be challenging to extend one's learning independently. Groups of managers who participate in the same training or workshop can hold each other accountable for incorporating what they learned into their daily practice. Some management seminars, like the ones pictured here, can be extremely expensive. An organization might increase the number of these one-time events by sending staff members in cohorts or over a number of years, and then creating space for staff to reflect on and apply what they learned. Some professional development includes heavy content that requires unpacking and reflection. For instance, the Racial Equity Institute or REI workshops or bystander trainings. This work isn't effective as a one-off. It must be sustained and supported in a space that feels psychologically safe for participants. Meeting once to debrief is good, but in our experience, committing to periodic gatherings has a higher impact. And to be clear, we certainly don't think libraries should stop paying for professional development for managers. There is tremendous value in leaving the workplace and learning alongside professionals outside your own institution. But we think it can be particularly powerful to pair formal training with ongoing self-organized communities of practice. And with that, I'll hand things over to Molly to provide suggestions for organizing your own group.
Thank you, Emily. Before we get into best practices, I'm going to pose a question in the chat. You have the power to form any community of practice you like, work-related or not. In just a few words, share the topic you would like to focus on in the chat. Surely folks have communities of practice they're already inspired to form or join. Oh, excellent. Oh, excellent. Crunch large data sets, that's great. Learning a dance style, awesome. Parents who are raising adolescents, yes. Oh, these are great. Well, feel free to keep them coming as I'm talking. Right now, I'm going to share some tips and best practices from putting these awesome ideas for groups into action. So just like the project teams that move our everyday work forward, a self-organized community of practice needs structure in order to flourish. First, someone needs to convene the group to get it started and to make sure meetings are scheduled as needed. Also, the group needs to know what it will be doing at their meetings. Agendas can be very detailed, or the group can select things like readings, podcasts, or discussion prompts to guide their learning, or they can come up with something else entirely. These responsibilities can be shared, or folks can take turns fulfilling the different roles required, but there should be some kind of formal structure in place. Let's look at a few examples. This is a screenshot of a running Google Doc we used for a reflective management discussion group. We had one convener who would organize our meetings, but then we could all contribute to the Google Doc agenda. And that way we were all organizers. The next example is a spreadsheet we use for the Anti-Racism Managers Reflection Group. So we have the meeting dates, and then each member of the group can sign up to facilitate a session, and then we note what we want the group to do in advance. In addition to convening your meetings, it's important to have ground rules to document group practices and norms. I want to emphasize that ground rules are not just essential for groups talking about topics that can create potentially harmful conversations like anti-racism. Every community of practice will benefit from ground rules. They help foster a sense of trust and keep interactions respectful. For example, ground rules can provide shared language that you can use to let your colleague know, or your friend, whoever's in the group, know that their point has wandered off course, or that they have been dominating the conversation and need to make room for others. There are lots of good ground rules examples out there in the world, so you do not have to start from scratch. On this slide, I've listed a few examples that can help you develop your own ground rules for your community. The Iowa State, we'll keep going. I encourage you to go back to those examples when you get a chance. Oh, awesome, thanks. So just real quick, we use the Iowa State University guidelines locally here at Duke University Libraries. DLF, the Digital Library Federation Code of Conduct, is wonderful, and they provide links to other codes of conduct. And this Harvard Business Review article is really helpful for taking some of the bigger ideas that you want your ground rules to foster, but actually take it down to specific actionable behaviors as well. All right, one last best practice I want to talk about is that you should be very intentional about group membership in your community. Group membership should reflect the group's purpose. Ideally, the group will include folks with a diversity of backgrounds and work experiences. If your community of practice is in the workplace, it can be really important for different roles and functions to be represented in the membership as well. That said, forming the membership of a group is a balancing act between being inclusive and making sure your group will be able to accomplish its goals. Sometimes this means not including folks. For example, the anti-racism group for middle managers here at Duke intentionally does not include AULs or non-managers. We felt peer learning among middle managers was the most important part of that group. Another example is that if your group is intended to extend something that you learned at a conference or training, you probably don't want to include folks that didn't share that experience. You should also consider the potential value of affinity and identity groups, especially when white participants run the risk of overburdening or even harming colleagues of color when discussing topics like anti-racism. So that's our talk. We're wrapping up. Here's the resources that we shared in the slides so you can go back to them. And we just want to thank you for attending. We have a minute or two for questions, but you can also contact us individually or all together if something comes up later. So if folks want to put their questions in the chat, that would be good. I see Zachary Tumlin made a comment that they would also recommend the Brave Space model by Aro and Clemens. Apology if I messed that up. And I think that was in reference to ground rules. Other questions or comments? Oh, excellent. Someone give us some general praise. Thank you. Advice for handling participants who request to enter a closed group. Emily or Ken, would you like to take that on? Or I can?
That's a challenging one. The first thing that came to mind, Kendra, is that you might suggest another group form on the same topic that they would begin using, and you could share some of the resources that you've used to start your own group, and they could put out an invitation or perhaps ask some colleagues to join that group. Do you have other ideas, Molly or Kim?
I think it goes back to being really intentional about your membership. And maybe that can be, you could almost codify that in your ground rules. And so you have something that's more impartial to point to, as opposed to, so it doesn't come off as, I don't want you in our group, which is definitely not what we're suggesting.
And to build on that, Molly, you might also consider, is it really a closed group? This might be a good opportunity for you to go back to your membership and ask, would we benefit from having someone else join? Why are we closed? Probably have time for one more question before we hand things over to our the next session.
I'll just share that when we formed the anti-racism managers group at Duke, I was at Duke at the time that we created that group. There was interest from a couple of people in upper management to be part of it, because we had done really a general call out to all managers to express interest. And when I was trying to let them know that we really wanted to be about peer managers, they were very understanding, actually. So I just wanted to share that had actually gone pretty well with trying to help us explain why there were things that we would want to learn from each other, and that the peer nature was really important.
I would like to thank Molly, Kim, and Emily for an interesting presentation. Definitely have some ideas on some new community of practice I might want to put out there, especially that learning a specific dance. That could be really interesting. Now we are going to pass it off to Laura and Tarita. Let me do a little bit of housekeeping here. And then we'll get right to it. There we go. One more, let me find Tarita. There she is. There we go. Okay, so moving right along to balance and guardrails. Tarita and Laura, would you like to take it away?
Yes, thank you very much, Allison. I'm Laura Blessing. I'm the Director of Library Human Resources and Administrative Operations at North Carolina State University Libraries, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'll let my co-presenter present herself.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, and I'm Sharita Nantish. I also use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Inclusion and Talent Management at NC State.
Okay, and thanks everyone for attending this great day full of presentations. Today, we're going to be talking about how over the past couple of years, we have been dealing with a lot of stress, maybe before then too, and we've all been searching for that elusive, healthy work-life balance. And in this presentation, we'll focus on some strategies that both employers and employees can use to manage and handle their work-life stress. And trying to get to, there we go, next page. And so we'll start off talking about the concept of guardrails, because you've probably heard people talk about boundaries, using work-life boundaries to separate things. And guardrails are meant to be more flexible. Now, this is not a term that I came up with on my own. It was Marcy Rader, is a consultant over in Chapel Hill, that introduced me to this concept. And she suggested thinking of it as rails on a child's bed that you could like lower and raise depending upon when you felt it was safe to do so. So guardrails are meant for your protection, and they can be removed at any time if you feel that it's safe. And some more definitions. I will admit right off the bat that I'm really bad about, like most people are, using that term stress. We even do it within this presentation, using it as if it's always a bad thing. But you've probably heard within psychology that stress is really just any response that you might have to your circumstances, a psychological or physiological response. And that could be a good thing, or it could be a bad thing. And distress is that kind of bad stress that you think of that might result in things like headaches and insomnia and stomach aches, things like that, that you want to stay away from. Whereas eustress is that like good level of activity and change going on that might even be motivating or energizing to you. So we wanted to talk today about some steps you could take that would put you more in that eustress mode rather than the distress mode. And we're going to do that by focusing first on individual guardrails. So there's practices that you could use, tips you can use to establish balance in your work life. And then later we'll talk about steps that the employers, managers, administrators can use to kind of help you build upon those and enforce those guardrails that you put into place. And I'll start out by just pointing out this other concept of voluntary versus involuntary attention. Voluntary attention being like you want to focus on something. You want to be paying attention when you're at a meeting or very focused on a project that you're doing. Whereas involuntary the smoke alarm goes off and you're going to have a reaction to it. Whether you want to have a reaction to it or not, whether you're trying to focus on something else, it's going to get your attention. And the same with phones ringing. And there's even a little bit of a danger that we all tend to think, oh, I can just ignore my smartphone, my email notifications that pop up whenever I'm focused on something, but you're not really ignoring them so much. You're really, you're just making these micro decisions not to pay attention to them. And a bunch of micro decisions then end up robbing you of the ability to make decisions like later on, or to just be able to focus on something. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how you might want to keep a few things from distracting you. Of course, you want to keep the smoke alarm battery going, because you don't want to not realize that's going off. But as far as just all of your gadgets, the software apps that you use, your email notifications, anything like that, any gadget you have will have some sort of control center that you can go into and temporarily turn off or mute your notifications from that when you want to be focused on something. So to be clear, I'm not talking about just like turning off all of your notifications all the time, but during those times that maybe you're in a meeting or you're trying to get work done, you can turn those off. And it is definitely worth time figuring out how to do that, and then remembering to do it when you're actually focusing on that. And then other examples of guardrails that you might want to put into practice. I kind of divide these up in my head between cues that you might have for someone else to help protect your focus time versus cues that you will have for yourself to remind yourself, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be focused. So the first couple of bullets I have here, setting a standard schedule on your calendar, or enforcing, maybe making it known that you have a maximum number of meetings that you can go to every day that are put on your calendar. Those are things that cue other people. Hey, don't schedule me for things outside of my work hours, or don't put the 7th or 8th meeting on my calendar for today. And then things like only reading emails at specified times, vacation notifications, and scheduling breaks on your calendar. That's what you do for yourself to remind yourself to be focused. And one of my favorite tips there, with a lot of people already use vacation notifications, of course, but if your supervisor will allow it, you can keep your vacation notifications on for one extra day after you come back, so that you'll have a chance to catch up on all those emails that you ignored, and maybe just have some time to focus and get back into the swing of things. But again, you might want to check with your supervisor. And as far as building breaks into your schedule, how do you do that? Well, you might want to use a timer or an app to remind yourself to do that. And then I would just say, like, get away from your screens is one of my biggest tips, because that's going to help you come back and focus later. And so you really just need that time to relax and regenerate. And actually getting up out of your chair, taking a stretch break, going on a walk, and definitely when you are going to lunch, make it a screen-free lunch. It is just too tempting to respond to that email, respond to that text from your colleague, and you will come back so much refreshed if you do not do that. And then I have to take a little reality check break here and admit that every job does have its busy times. You may not always be able to have your guardrails up, and that's exactly why we call them guardrails. They are flexible. And you all know when your busy times are for your schedule, for your unit and your position, or maybe it comes up as a surprise once in a while, like, oh, wow, we're really busy today. And those are times that you might want to consider lowering your guardrails. Maybe it's going in and reading email more often, or accepting more meetings during a specific period of time. I would suggest, though, to look at the big picture and see if there's other areas that you could lower your guardrails. Maybe you're doing less professional development, working on committee work less, that sort of thing that you could put on pause while you are focusing on something else. All of these tips we're talking about today are really best put into practice within an organization that also has this concept of guardrails and certain things they put into practice to make it easier for all of their employees to have a healthy work-life balance. And that's what my colleague Tarita is about to talk about.
Hey, thanks, Laura, for leading in there. Yeah, so in other words, what are some more sort of structural approaches to supporting workplace wellness within the organizational level? So next slide, please. So and the reason that this is important is that even the best individual strategies that we put in place in our own lives are going to be really limited without any sort of broader managerial or organizational commitment to staff wellness and support. So I remember seeing early on in the pandemic this meme about the extreme levels of stress and burnout and fear that a lot of folks were feeling, and the solution being proposed was, here, have a wellness webinar, right? Which isn't so much a structural solution. So our organizations and managers also need to develop their own strategies for support, in support of their staff rather. And so some questions to ask yourself, particularly if you're in a positional leadership position, include, how is it that we are advocating, proactively advocating for staff wellness and guardrails? In other words, what are we already seeing, or what do we anticipate, and how can we address it proactively rather than once everyone is already burned out? As one example, I know of a library director who was asked by a professional organization to distribute a really intensive set of surveys to their staff for some sort of regional project. And while the director did value what they were trying to assess, they had the presence of mind of knowing that their staff had already been way surveyed out by a set of intensive surveys, both within their libraries and their institution. And so they were able to kind of read the room, proactively protect their time, and decide not to sort of distribute it to their staff and communicating it back to that association. Also, what is it that managers can do to model their values, right? And their own guardrails for staff. So what is it that I'm doing in my everyday, for instance, to help instill a certain type of culture? And then finally, how can organizations and managers engage staff in that process, right? So rather than kind of brainstorming in a vacuum, really listening and engaging with our staff so we have an idea of whether what we're proposing actually aligns with their needs, or is it going to be seen like that wellness webinar, right? Not meaningfully addressing the actual concerns that they have. And then certainly making sure to constantly communicate, make adjustments for ongoing input and accountability. Next slide, please. Somewhat related to that, so start with the why, and then you'll be able to kind of build the hows out from there. So as an example, we often come up with strategic plans, strategic priorities that are very patron-centered, in libraries. But something that I know I've always appreciated is when I see an organizational plan or other sort of documentation that really takes into account what is it that we're going to do to support and develop our staff, right? So if you haven't already, define what your organizational, departmental, or even your own personal managerial values and mission are with regards to your staff. Say, if your mission is to create an inclusive and equitable department culture that supports well-being, professional development, and empowerment, for instance, then how will you work to achieve that? In stressful times especially, take a look and assess the purpose of your current or anticipated activities and commitments and how they align to those values then, right? Or if they will actually contribute to job creep and burnout. And relatedly, define what are the sort of mission critical work is that you have and what might need to be tabled now or sunset, which I know is really hard for us to do in libraries. But you can ask, are the conditions right to start something new? What might we want to stop because the return on investment is not so great at this moment? And what are we going to continue to do? And then as you sort of categorize these core activities, you'll get a better sense of how many things fall into each of those buckets and how sustainable that all is. Somewhat related to that is this last point, which is the preempt, detect, and remedy model of stressors. This model, which is provided in one of the articles that we provide at the end of the session, asks managers to preempt stressors by creating a culture of care. So managers modeling wellness, doing regular assessments of job design, like monitoring workloads, and then detecting emerging issues by collecting data. So actively listening to people, pulse surveys, that sort of thing. And one thing that can also be done is embedding wellness into, say, the review process. So rather than using the annual review as just a time to provide individual feedback, using that to also sort of share with your staff member and asking and listening for ways that you can better support their wellness and growth for the year ahead. And then finally, remedy. So thinking about what sort of internal solutions are available to address it, or if you need to look externally. Next slide, please. So really quickly, some concrete things to consider, and I totally recognize, both of us recognize that this might be not as directly transferable to all organizations, and perhaps not in these exact forms. Many of these came out of our collaborative and remote work task force at our libraries. And if you were here earlier today, you would have seen their excellent presentation that it talks about these and a lot of other things in far more detail. But establishing, what does flexible look like for us today? And what will that look like for us in the future, right? So we often talk about this in terms of flexible time and work locations, but again, what is that going to look like, especially for staff who might be more physically tied to the building? And this also leads into determining, what does equity, which is not the same as equality, right, look like across the organization, and how can we build that sort of equity of flexibility? Something else that I love that was talked about earlier is that we have no meeting days every month, kind of strategically selected to bear in mind holidays and different work schedules, and meeting lists on Friday afternoons. So having this as a norm across the organization is a structural practice that helps us to recognize that need for focused time. Staff buffering or cross-training, such as job sharing, can also help, so that, you know, if one person is out, the entire structure doesn't crumble. And so that could be a good opportunity to generally invest in training or find other ways to support your team's overall skill development during a time. Again, this was mentioned earlier, but modeling and also communicating your own sort of individual practices, what it is that you're doing for yourself, and being really transparent about that. And finally, assessing the physical environment and how that contributes to wellness. If people don't have spaces where they can, you know, eat comfortably away from their desk or take a break, that might inadvertently create an environment where they feel they have to be tied to their desk. So outdoor seating areas, really appealing break rooms, that sort of thing can really help to support our staff in getting up and taking a break. Of course, a lot of this has to also take into consideration that whole guardrail concept again. You know, are there certain things that we have to be, or that we can be somewhat flexible? What will those be? And more importantly, like, what are our shared understanding of our organizational guardrails, right? And what is it that we can do as an organization, as managers, to support and understand each other's individual guardrails, right? Next slide. These are just some of the resources. I know it's a little hard to read, but we'll provide it after today if you want to read up on some of what we discussed and some other tips and tricks. And then finally, last slide. Yeah, so we only touched on a few things here, but we hope this gives you a few sort of nuggets and things to consider and ask yourself. And of course, we also provide our contact information here if you're so compelled to reach out to us afterwards. So thanks so much, everyone, for your engagement and time.
Thank you. And if you have questions, you could either unmute yourself and just say them, or you could put something in the chat and we can try and respond. And I see Hillary. Thank you for joining us, Hillary, from our remote hybrid work. There we go. You know, better practices team. Yeah, thanks for adding that. Anyone else? I think Tarita did a great job of reminding us that those that the organizational practices do need to be dependent upon what your core operational needs are. And I think that's true for yourself as well. When you're thinking of what boundaries do I need to raise and lower? What are my departmental core operational needs, and what are my specific jobs core operational needs? Yeah, and you see, I really like the idea of Friday afternoon meetings. Yes, that has been wonderful. I will say another thing that goes around along with those organizational boundaries is, unfortunately, they're only organizational. So it's only within the library. So in my own position, I do sometimes end up having to have a Friday afternoon meeting with a campus colleague or TRLN, something like that. But it is so nice to only occasionally have that. And it's, you know, not every Friday. Most of the time I get time off to actually get stuff done.
I would co-sign that. I had a former coworker who, for herself, created as much as she could sort of a no meeting Mondays for herself, which is great. But, you know, since that was more of an individual thing as opposed to kind of an organizational understanding, sometimes that didn't create tension. But, you know, it was just, again, you know, it's better to kind of have some things in place that's kind of a general understanding, a general culture, as opposed to always leaving it up to individuals to decide for themselves, if that makes sense.
I hate to cut this off, because we're doing great here. We have so many comments, especially about no emails on Friday afternoons as well, no meetings on Fridays, and then staff wellness, included an annual review process, and the no monthly meeting days. I think what I'm getting from this is that folks would really like some fewer meetings in their schedules. But I really do appreciate presenters from both of our presentations that we had in this session. This was a lot of fun getting to hear both and all these new ideas, creative ideas. I'm going to let everyone go. It is lunchtime. Enjoy your bit of a break. We have posters presentations starting at 12:30. So we will see you all back here shortly.